There are moments that arrive without warning and leave you permanently rearranged. The production notes for the Tillman family said, "One member visually impaired, mobility independent, no accommodations required." That was all. 3 phrases, written by the casting coordinator who had spoken with the family on the phone, and who had noted the information the way you note logistical details, efficiently, accurately, and without fully imagining what it would look like when Grace Tillman walked onto the Family Feud stage for the first time, and the studio fell completely silent before a single word had been said. She was 14 years old. She had been blind since the age of 3 from a degenerative retinal condition that had arrived quietly and taken everything her eyes could do over the course of 18 months. Long enough for her to remember light and color in the specific, detailed way of someone who lost something real and knows precisely what is missing and has decided, with the matter-of-fact resolution of a child who had no other option, to build a full life in the space where those things used to be. She walked without a cane that day. She had one, she used it in unfamiliar environments, but she had practiced the route from the stage entrance to the contestant mark 4 times the previous afternoon during the venue walkthrough that the production team had quietly arranged after her mother called and asked if they could come an hour early. She had counted the steps, catalogued the turns, noted the texture change in the flooring where the backstage gave way to the stage itself. She knew the distance. She walked it with the particular confidence of someone who has converted information into certainty, which is the only kind of certainty that does not depend on sight. She wore a blue dress. Her hair was down. She carried nothing. The audience saw her come through the curtain, and something in the room reorganized itself before it had decided to. It was not pity. It was closer to attention. The involuntary focusing that happens when something enters a space that changes the quality of the space. She was smiling, not for the room, but the way some people smile generally, as a condition of their presence rather than a response to a specific stimulus. She moved to the mark and stood on it, and turned to face the audience with a precision that suggested she knew exactly where the audience was, which she did, because her mother had told her, and because she had counted. The Tillman family arranged themselves around her. Her mother, Denise, 46, who had the careful, vigilant posture of a woman who has spent 11 years being the eyes for someone she loves, without ever making that visible. Her older brother Jordan, 19, who stood close to Grace in the way of siblings who have developed a physical language for looking out for each other without words. Her Aunt Patricia, 52, who had driven from Memphis and who had cried twice on the flight and was determined not to cry again until it was appropriate, which she sensed might be soon. And her father, Robert, 48, who was a large, quiet man who coached youth football and who stood behind Grace with the protective stillness of someone who has learned that protection, for this particular person, is best delivered invisibly. Steve Harvey came down the stage toward them in the usual fashion, easy, warm, reading the room. He got to within 10 feet of the family, and he stopped. He stopped, the way a person stops when something has interrupted the automatic. He looked at Grace. He looked at the family. He looked at Grace again. Later, a production assistant who had been standing near the lighting console said that what happened to Steve Harvey's face in those 2 seconds was not something she had seen before in 3 years of working the show. She said it was not one expression but several, arriving in sequence, recognition, recalibration, something she described, after thinking about it, as a person updating their understanding of a room in real time. He stood for 2 seconds. Then he walked the remaining 10 feet and he said, "Good afternoon," to the family. And then he stopped in front of Grace and he said, specifically to her. "Hello," she said. "Hello, Steve Harvey." She said his full name, both words, the way you say the name of someone you have been told you are going to meet. He said, "You know who I am." She said, "I've listened to your show for 2 years. I know what you sound like," she said. "You sound taller in person." The audience laughed. Steve Harvey laughed. Something in the room shifted from careful attention to something warmer and more open. The way a room shifts when its tension has been released, by exactly the right thing said, in exactly the right way, by exactly the right person. He said, "I have never been told that in my life." She said, "It's the acoustics. Your voice bounces differently in a larger room." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "How old are you?" She said, 14. He said, 14. Not a question, the word with its weight. The game was announced. Steve Harvey moved into his role with the practiced ease of a man who has done this 10,000 times. But something in his movement was different, more deliberate, the way you move when you are aware of what is in the room, in a way you were not aware of 60 seconds ago. He addressed the full family for the opening, asked the usual questions, got the usual warm answers. Then he came back to Grace. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said yes. He said, "What's it like, being here, on this stage?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone gathering courage, the quiet of someone who takes questions seriously and wants to answer accurately. She said, "It's loud, but good loud, the kind that means people are paying attention." She paused. "Usually when it gets quiet around me, it's because people don't know what to say. This feels different." Steve Harvey looked at her. He said, "Different how?" She said, "It feels like people are listening, not just—" She paused. "Not just looking." The studio fell completely silent. It was a different silence from the silences that had come before it in the room's history. Different from the silence of surprise, different from the silence of grief, different from the silence of something large arriving. This silence was the silence of a room that had just been described to itself accurately, and recognized the description, and did not know what to do with the recognition. Steve Harvey stood in front of Grace Tillman, and was, by every available measure, not performing anything. He said, "Do people look a lot?" She said yes. She said it without complaint, without accusation, as information. "People look at me and they get quiet and then they talk to whoever I'm with instead of me. Like I left the room, even though I'm standing right there." Nobody in the studio said anything. She said, "I don't mind it as much as I used to. I understand why it happens." She paused. "But I like it better when people just talk to me. Like you're doing." Steve Harvey pressed both hands flat against his own chest. He looked at the floor for a moment. He looked up. He said, "I need everyone in this room to hear what she just said." He turned to the audience. "This 14-year-old girl just described what it feels like to be invisible while you're standing in front of people. And she said it without anger. She said she understands." He stopped. "I don't know if I would understand. I don't know if most of us would." The studio fell completely silent. Denise, Grace's mother, had her hand at her mouth. She was not crying yet. She was in that precise moment before crying, where the body has made its decision and the face is still catching up. Robert, behind Grace, was looking at his daughter with the expression of a man seeing something he already knew, in a context that made it new. Jordan, 19, standing to his sister's left, was looking straight ahead at nothing. His jaw was set. He had heard his sister say similar things before, variations of this, across years, in car rides and kitchen tables, and conversations that started about something else and arrived here. He had heard it, and he had been angry about it on her behalf, and he had learned, watching her, to convert the anger into something more useful. He was doing that now. His face was doing that. Aunt Patricia, who had cried twice on the flight and was determined not to do so again, had reached her determination's limit. A camera operator at the far end of the stage had stopped moving his camera. Steve Harvey turned back to Grace. He said, "Can I ask you something else?" She said yes. He said, "What do you want to do? When you're older, what are you working toward?" She answered without pausing. She said, "I want to be a music teacher." She said, "I play piano. I've been playing since I was 5. Before and after." She said before and after the way people say those words when they mean something specific by them. I think music is the thing that doesn't change based on what you can see. It's the same for everyone who's listening. The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey did not speak for 5 seconds. 5 seconds in which the room held what she had said and turned it over and felt the weight of it. He said, "Say that again." She said, "Music is the same for everyone who's listening." He said, "Yes. Just that. Yes." He turned to the camera. He stood the way he stands when the game has stopped and something more important is in the room. He said, "I want to talk to everyone watching at home." He said it quietly, in the register he uses when he means something all the way down. There is a 14-year-old girl on this stage who cannot see the lights or the audience or the cameras. She cannot see her family standing beside her. She cannot see me. He paused. And she just told this room something about belonging and music and being heard that I am going to be thinking about for the rest of my life. He stopped. We spend so much time on what we can see, on appearances, on surfaces, on what things look like. He stopped again. She can't see any of that, and she is the clearest person in this room. The studio fell completely silent. Then a sound came from the audience. Not applause, not quite, something prior to applause, something that comes from the chest before the hands know what to do. And then the hands knew. But Steve wasn't done. He looked at Denise. He said, "How did you raise her like this?" Denise lowered her hand from her mouth. She said, "I didn't." She said, "She raised herself like this. She stopped. "I just tried to stay out of her way." Grace turned her head slightly toward her mother at the sound of her voice. She said, "That's not true." She said, "She never let anyone treat me like I was less. Not once, not ever." She said it with the precision of someone reporting an 11-year record. Whenever someone talked to her instead of me, she'd say, Grace smiled, and it was the full smile, the one that had been there since she walked in. She'd say, "Grace is right here. You can ask her." Denise made a sound that was not a word. Robert, behind Grace, pressed his hand to his eyes. Steve Harvey turned to Denise and said, "Every parent in this audience heard what your daughter just said about you." He looked at the room. Every one. He looked back. "You are a great mother. I need to say that plainly, in this building, in front of all these people." He paused. "Grace is who she is partly because you refuse to let the world make her smaller." The studio fell completely silent. The competing family, the Moores, from Atlanta, a warm and lively family who had come prepared to play a game show and had spent the last 22 minutes standing at their podium being permanently rearranged, stood without moving. Their team captain, a woman named Beverly, 44, had her arms folded and her head bowed and was nodding slowly to herself the way people nod when something is landing in them in real time. Beverly crossed the stage. She did not ask permission. She walked to Denise and she said, "I have a daughter. She's 9. She stopped. I needed to hear that. About not letting the world make her smaller. She said it to Denise, and then she looked at Grace and she said, "Thank you." Grace said, "You're welcome," in the tone of someone who understood what was being thanked without needing it explained. But Steve still wasn't done. He asked Grace if she would play. She said she had come to play. He said the family was going to need her best. She said, "I know. I've been listening to the surveys for 2 years. I have thoughts about the methodology." Steve Harvey looked at the audience. He said, "Methodology." He said it the way you say a word that a 14-year-old has just used correctly in a sentence on a game show stage. She said, "Methodology." He pointed at her. "She's going to win this game." She did not win the game. They came within 19 points in the final round, which was closer than any other team had come against the Moors that season. And Grace buzzed in 4 correct answers in the 3rd round, including the top answer on a question about things people do when they're nervous, which she answered, correctly, first, without hesitation, with, "Listen more carefully." Steve Harvey looked at that answer on the board for a moment before he moved on. He said, "Of course that's the top answer." He said it quietly, not for the audience. He said it the way you say something you have just learned. The Moors from Atlanta won by 19 points, and Beverly cried in the parking lot afterward in a way she later described to her husband as not having anything to do with winning. The clip aired 10 days later. By the end of the first day, it had 58 million views. By the end of the week, 96 million. It was the first Family Feud clip in the show's history to be covered by both entertainment outlets and disability rights organizations simultaneously, and for the same reason. Not because it depicted struggle or triumph in the conventional sense, but because it depicted a 14-year-old girl being exactly who she was, in public, under bright lights she couldn't see, with a clarity that made everyone looking feel briefly, unexpectedly, more honest about themselves. The American Foundation for the Blind shared it. The National Federation of the Blind shared it. 17 schools for the visually impaired shared it in their newsletters. A music teacher in Portland, Oregon, who had been blind since birth and who had been teaching elementary school music for 22 years, watched the clip and wrote a letter to the show. She said she had never, in those 22 years, heard anyone outside her own community articulate what she felt about music the way Grace had. She said she framed the quote and put it on her classroom wall. She said her students, who ranged from sighted to fully blind, had been asking about it every day since. 3 months later, the show established, in partnership with a national music education nonprofit, the Grace Tillman Music Access Fund, providing instruments, lessons, and adaptive materials to blind and visually impaired students in underfunded school districts. The initial grant covered 47 students in 11 states. Grace was asked to record a short message for the fund's launch video. She played 30 seconds of piano first, before she spoke. The piece was something she had written herself. It had no name. She said she hadn't named it yet because she was still learning what it was about. A year after the taping, Grace was 15 and had performed at 3 school events and 1 community concert. She had also, at her school's request, spoken to the incoming freshman class about what she called the difference between looking and seeing, which was a distinction she had been making privately for years, and which she delivered publicly with the same matter-of-fact clarity that had stopped a television studio on a Thursday afternoon. Several teachers in the audience said afterward that they had been teaching for decades and had just been taught something. Jordan, her brother, 19 at the time of the taping, had enrolled in an education program by the following fall. He told his advisor he wanted to teach. She asked what subject. He said he hadn't decided yet, but that he knew what kind of teacher he wanted to be. She asked what kind. He said, the kind that talks to the person, not around them. Denise still said it when the situation required, "Grace is right here. You can ask her." She had been saying it for 11 years, and she expected to say it for as long as the situation required, which she hoped was forever, because forever meant Grace was still in the room. Robert, who was large and quiet and coached youth football, watched the clip when it aired the way you watch something you were present for. Not for new information, but for the strange experience of seeing a moment that belongs to you become something that belongs to everyone. He watched it once. He watched it a second time. He did not watch it a third time because the second time he had looked at his daughter's face in the clip. At the moment she said, "Music is the same for everyone who's listening," and seen something there that he had seen in the room, but that the camera had caught from an angle he hadn't had, and he had needed to put the phone down and go sit in another room for a few minutes by himself. He was fine. He was completely fine. He just needed a few minutes. Grace practiced piano on Thursday evenings, as she always had, in the living room, with the bench positioned by memory and the sheet music she didn't need open on the stand because she liked the way it sounded when the pages turned. She was working on something new, still unnamed, still becoming, the way pieces are before they know what they are. Her mother sat in the kitchen on Thursday evenings and listened, not because she had to, because she wanted to be somewhere the music was. We built a world organized almost entirely around what can be seen, around surfaces and appearances, and the immediate information of the visual. And then occasionally, someone arrives who has built themselves entirely without it. And what they show us, without meaning to, is what we have been missing by looking too hard at the wrong things. Grace Tillman walked onto a stage she couldn't see, in front of an audience she couldn't see, under lights she couldn't see, and said, "It feels like people are listening." She said it like it was rare. She said it like it was a gift. She was right on both counts. If this story rearranged something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because there are more stories here that have always deserved to be told.